And welcome to another BrewCast with HBYOB. And a couple people here with me. I'm Mark. I have the owner, which again, I never know on the camera if you're really on my right, my left, whatever. Joey, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Fine. And on camera, Mr. Chris. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing all right. How you guys doing?
We're doing fine.
You got your bags packed for the weekend, Chris?
Yes, sir.
We're talking personal stuff.
No. Just
right. We're going to get right into it because the last show was one of our better shows. We actually, I think, taught people things.
I thought so. It's a good conversation.
I think so. And I really thought today we'd be talking. Okay, if people are tuning in to hear about us create a recipe, we'll see you in 2 weeks because I think, well, I really believe we didn't quite finish on ingredients and how they affect your recipe. I got a few questions still on that. And then we're going to go a little bit into what equipment and how the equipment would affect the same recipe. And then next week, we'll actually build a recipe.
All right.
Next show. So, we'll kind of, go that route because it was brought to my attention. One of the things I wanted to talk about is, back to ingredients and how it affects your recipe is talking to Joey, the owner of HBYOB is, my question to him earlier today was how important every ingredient is, which I think we discussed last week or last show. It's pretty important, but how much substitution can go on and what ingredients do you have some leeway in to keep the recipe somewhat similar or maybe improve a little bit, I guess. I mean, could be either way. So that's what I asked Joey. I didn't realize you have here some substitution sheets that you use a lot, which I guess to me, that's the first thing good to let people know. So if people come in and either don't know what they need or you're out of something, you have ways to help them still get close. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, if it for hops, a lot of times it'll just be, there are so many hops out there. We couldn't even think about carrying every single one of them, but sometimes availability just makes certain hop I know Galaxy for a long time was extremely hard to get. So there are other options out there that are they exact? No, but they're within the right realm, because if you were to say use Pearl instead of Galaxy, you're going to have a wildly different beer. Yeah. A lot of those German hops have nice spicy notes to them, earthy notes to them, grassy notes to them, versus a lot of like the IPA hops have that nice fruity aroma. I mean, we were drinking this beer and you already said as soon as we open it up, very citrusy. So as long as like, okay, I don't have, whatever, knowing the hops that are very close is important.
Yeah.
Now, Chris, when you build a recipe or you're doing something, do you do that too sometimes? Do you look for little substitutions where maybe it will make your beer better? Or do you want to stick to the recipe and you only do substitutions if you can't get what you want? When you're looking to brew, what are you trying to do?
It depends. If I find a recipe, let's say like a clone recipe, and I think we've always talked about, let's say like Sierra Nevada as being, let's say like the baseline. It's just like the one that everybody like we got into when we got into drinking or got into like home brewing.
Yeah.
Sierra Nevada was like one of the ones. So if I found a clone recipe for something that I really liked, I would want to stick to that as much as possible. Now, if it's just something that I've made if I've just created like a one-off recipe, it's more about just what I'm going for. And we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago about, well, what am I trying to do with each ingredient? Like, let's say, then sticking with the hops, like, do I want a fruity aroma with the hops? Okay, so then, sure, I might start with Citra. And like Joey, he's probably seen this on the recipes that I've sent him. I'll probably say a hop variant, but if he doesn't have that in stock, then I'll list off maybe one or two other ones that he maybe might have in stock just in case, because it's more about that I'm
not to interrupt. Are those other ones something you've already come up with as an option, or the other ones would you rely on him to say, hey, I don't have this, but this is something that will work for you for this recipe?
50-50. It's might be something that I'm going for. So it's like, instead of Citra, I might just say, if you've got Galena, throw it in my bag. Or if he'd be like, well, I don't have that, but I've got this instead. Okay, fine. I trust your judgment. So it's just, it really is just kind of playing off of what I'm going for in the recipe, and also what he has available at least in that particular situation.
Yeah, hops can be kind of a little challenging because you're never talking a 1-to-1. Like when I mentioned pearl hops, I mean, honestly, Sauce, Tentenang, Willamette, they're all very, very similar hops. And a lot of times they pick up different names. Just we were talking about that before, and where they're grown. So, I mean, and even like soil conditions. I mean, there are Czech hops, there are German hops, there are American hops. And even though they might be the same variety, I mean, we know from probably coffee and a lot of other things where the regions where they're grown, even if they're, say, Centennial, if they're grown in Germany or they're grown in America, they're even going to taste different just based on the climate conditions of, you know, I mean, we know it from wineries. You know, there's a reason why Napa Valley and Italy are the two biggest wine producers, because they grow the best grapes, similar to coffee. But when most commonly, I would say what happens in store is yeast. Yeast is a big one. Liquid yeast is the most perishable of everything that we have here in the store. When there are different times of year, it's like Oktoberfest yeast. I can't keep them in stock in the fall, but in the spring, virtually nobody wants them. So those are the ones that get challenging. The great thing is we carry in the store White Labs. I'm just talking liquid yeast right now. White Labs, Y yeast, Imperial yeast. I think I'm missing one, but Omega yeast. The nice thing about them are, if we don't have it from White Labs, Imperial makes an equivalent. Y yeast makes an equivalent. So now you're talking the exact strain, just who made it. And all of those yeast companies that we carry in the store are in the United States. So back to when you're doing yeast like that, you shouldn't have a taste difference at all. As long as you're doing, like I have substitution charts for the different yeast manufacturers. So odds are, if you come in here and say, I want WOP 500, if we don't have it by Imperial or Y yeast, we'll be able to get you that exact strain. So that won't make your beer taste different.
Based on that, because of hops, what about temperatures and amounts? Meaning if you went, okay, I don't have this for your recipe, but if you use this one, but this amount, either less or more, or this temperature or this, I mean, is there ways to mess with it that way, or is it pretty much
not really?
If it calls for a certain amount, you need that same amount regardless which strand?
I mean, when it comes to yeast, I've said it a bunch. You can't add too much. You can certainly add too little, but you really can't add too much. So the more yeast, the better. You have to be careful, because if you get going too crazy with it, one, you add a lot of cost to your beer, and two, you can have some very violent explosive fermentations. And everyone's had a fermenter on the bucket on the other side of the room at one time in their brewing career. And that's where temperature kind of comes into play. I had it happen once where I had yeast all over the rafters in my basement. The lid was on the other side, and it was because my temperature probe was not telling the right temperature. And I think I pitched the yeast at like 3 degrees. And so it was just, it was a wheat beer. So it just violently exploded in fermentation.
I guess when I was thinking amounts, I was thinking more on the hops part, meaning if you went with a hop that was maybe not as citrusy, but you actually use more of it, could that be a replacement?
So when you're talking, like, say, bittering addition, now you are strictly talking basically alpha acids going into the boil. So if we make a substitution at 60 minutes, I tell people pick whatever. In a nutshell, you could pick any variety on my shelf that are the same alpha acids of what your recipe is calling for at your 60-minute additions. In theory, you should not notice a difference. So if all you're talking 60-minute hop additions, it should not matter what hop you're using, as long as the alpha acids match the same. Or if you put it into a piece of brewing software, it says these are 9.6. The one I had was supposed to be 6 alpha acids. So it'll do the math of saying, obviously, if the one you're putting in there is stronger in alpha acids, you'll need less. And I know I hate it all over IBUs, but that's where that's very helpful. And that's where IBUs are very, very helpful to a beer, is if you're, and not to mention, every single year, because I thought about this from the last cast, and I think it was Frank that asked about, like, if you buy the hops from a different supplier.
Right.
Well, the thing I forgot to mention was every year we get hops, the alpha, because they're grown. They're not they can't control the alpha acids to the, perfectly. So every crop year, the alpha acids are different. So to answer Frank's questions from 2 weeks ago, the answer is it does matter who you buy it from, once you know the alpha acids are different. And even if you buy, there was one year we had Northern Brewer hops here that were like 11% alpha acids. And then I had someone come in and mention something, and they were like 3.7 from crop year to crop year. That's night and day different. So I actually learned, because I was stocking I was stocking German Northern Brewer hops versus American Northern Brewer hops, and that was one of the biggest nuances back to growing conditions. Right. The alpha acids were tremendously different, and that's when I learned as a store owner, man, you got to really make sure you're staying consistent with the country that the hops are being grown in, because when you're putting them on your website with certain alpha acids and beta acids,
the number changes.
It changes when it's from country to country, and it was during the pandemic, so I was just trying to get something in, and I was like, oh, this isn't the one I normally get, but the one I normally get's out of stock, so I'll get these one instead. And come to find out, it took me a little while to realize it. Yeah.
What about finishing hops?
So like once you hit like 30 minutes or below, that's where definitely the closer you can stick with what your recipe is calling for, the better. But also bear in mind the alpha acids once again. Now, once you start talking to flame out additions or whirlpool additions, then the alpha acids kind of be a little bit subjective again. You're really just trying to pull the oils from the hops that have the aroma and the flavor. Obviously, the higher alpha acids, generally the more pungent they're going to be. So but it almost can, then you're kind of splitting hairs a little bit when it comes to alpha acids when you get late into the boil.
Now, because you know me, I was a cheap brewer, so I always use dry yeast. If you use the same dry yeast versus liquid yeast, but you use the same specifications for the recipe, how much difference would you see? And maybe I'll ask Chris first. Chris, have you substituted liquid for dry yeast based on a recipe?
I have, yeah. And like, have I seen any sort of like demonstrable difference like between the two? No, not really. If anything, I would almost advocate for brewers that are getting into it to, like we were talking a couple weeks ago about limiting the different like number of variables. Like if you can, just try and stick with the same style, try and stick with the same type of recipe. And then if you can, stick with the same yeast packet. Like if you can just say like, I'm just going to brew stuff that would require like SO4, SO5 or something like that. You're still going to get the same quality of beer. Like if you continue to use that same yeast style, that same yeast strain, versus always paying up, let's say like $3, $4, $5 extra for like the liquid yeast, which at least in my personal experience hasn't really netted me anything more in terms of, I don't know, like more efficiency or anything like that afterwards. So if you can, because I think a lot of home brewers, like especially when they're first starting off, they'll see the need, or they'll see the recipe call for like a liquid yeast strain, pay the extra few bucks, and when you can just make that substitution and just use a dry yeast packet, and then it'll probably get you to the same spot because you have so many other things that you're learning at the same time anyway. I think that's more where the nuance and understanding the differences between the two, that would be something for farther on down the road. But I think that's where understanding the substitutions can be actually really helpful at that point, like especially in that particular area, because the price difference is so great between like liquid and dry yeast packets.
Well, I would argue like even when I first started brewing, which was 10, 15 years ago, somewhere in that vicinity, there was a huge difference between liquid and dry yeast. I remember you talking about, Chris, those kits we would get online. Every single one of them came with that same Mutton's yellow and green pack.
Same packet.
Who the hell knows what it was? Nowadays, because truly in the early days of me brewing, I mean, you basically had ale yeast, lager yeast, and that were your dry options.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you went with the liquid companies because then they really got
get more detail.
Strain specific or style specific. They've really caught up in the dry yeast now. I mean, for example, like California ale, the most popular yeast on the market, or American ale, same thing. There are USO5 is a dry equivalent, and I would take the Pepsi challenge that I couldn't taste the difference in the beer. Now, when you start talking, and I get asked it from a lot of people, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like back to we talked before when we talked about when it was really cold outside. In the winter months, if you're buying online from me or wherever, I would say let's try to find a dry option for that particular recipe, because it going through FedEx or UPS, even though I put an ice pack on, especially nowadays, it could take a good week to get.
Right.
Yeah.
By the time it gets to you, if your yeast doesn't have its viability anymore because it got way too hot and destroyed the yeast, you would have just been better off using liquid or dry yeast. Now, if you can come in store and, you can get it home safely, all that, then I would still go with the liquid strains. But there's so many strains that are comparable to the liquid options, but the liquid still has so many more options than the dry. So that's my thing. It's like people ask me, which do you prefer, liquid or dry yeast? And I tell people, what am I brewing? Tell me what I'm brewing, and I'll tell you which one I'm going to use. If I'm going to do an IPA, I'm going to go with dry yeast because the yeast isn't the star of the show. I just need something clean, just gets the job done. Now, if I was doing like a Hefeweizen, where there's so many variables, like people like purposely underpitch that yeast to put it under stress to really pull out the banana and clove. There's so many practices people do because in a Hefeweizen, the yeast is what you're tasting in the beer. You're not really tasting too much. It's basically malt and yeast, and hops really aren't much of a factor other than balancing the beer. So then I would say if you're making a Hefeweizen, then absolutely use liquid yeast. Now, if you want to do an American wheat, go back to dry because you're just looking for something more on the cleaner end. So it really just depends.
Well, let me ask you another way then. Let's say, because that's kind of what we're doing is how it affects recipe. Let's say we want to make the most identical beer 10 times. Meaning we've come up with a recipe and we want to make this 10 times and make it as similar as possible every time. Am I more likely to get the same result with a dry yeast or not?
I would say it'd be the same.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I would say if you're wanting to go over and over again, because this actually kind of like segues to a good topic, I won't hang up on it too much, is you'll start hearing house yeast a lot. And house yeast in breweries basically means we've been reusing the yeast.
Right.
So if you're
Budweiser's using the same yeast strain, I'm sure.
Oh, I watched a thing on Jack Daniels and they have it like vaulted and slanted and all that. Jack Daniels hasn't bought yeast since they started.
Right.
But in beer brewing, if you want to brew the same beer and say you want it 10 times, I would say learn how to wash and reuse your own yeast because that's going to adapt to your conditions at your home. So back to the yeast is actually in better condition when you're reusing it. Then when it comes fresh out fresh out the pack is not as good as if you're recycling that yeast in your home. The downfall is you can't call it after so many generations of using it. You can't call it that anymore because it's mutated into something different.
Right. Chris, have you reused yeast before?
No, it freaks me out. I don't know what it is about it.
Joey, what percentage of your customers might be doing it?
It's not as much anymore because back to the convenience of just cutting the top and throwing it in there.
Yeah.
I mean, even at I think our most expensive yeast is like $11.
Right.
I mean, even at $11, the hassle, and not to mention, like I tell people all the time, when you reuse yeast, now you're flirting with potentially infecting a beer. Because when you're reusing it, it's that more at risk of getting infected. So back to for $11, between the pain in the butt of doing it, and if you get that you got furry friends growing on the top of your fermenter, for a lot of people, it just shies them away from.
Chris, have you ever come close to doing it? Meaning, have you collected it and just not reused it or anything?
I did for a year. I reused the same strain for a year.
So how many times though? How many times did you use it for that year? Every time you brewed?
At least a dozen. Okay. I reuse the same yeast probably close to 20.
Well, all right, write that down, Greg. We'll talk about more. That's not really this topic, the ingredient itself, but we will talk. I'm kind of because I kind of thought that back in the day. How, like you said, the prices change a little bit, but how hard or how easy it is to do, we get into that.
I did develop an easier way to do it than what I was doing it because I was washing my yeast, and like I said, we can get into a topic for another day. But what I will say from this is back to I was using a plate stir, and the one thing I noted when I did it. For those brewing, Krausen is basically the foam that builds up on top of your beer. And I would make a starter between every single brew because I reused it. It might sit in my refrigerator for 2, 3, 4 weeks. So I would build a starter from the yeast that I was reusing just to make sure it was still viable. And back to I would take the top off and smell it, make sure it wasn't.
I mean, I've reused yeast to make bread. I have, where you make the yeast to make bread. I've done that a few times for like sourdough bread.
I've done it twice, and the biggest reason why I quit doing it is the one time I came in, the Krausen that builds up on top of there, every time I reused it, it got higher and higher and higher. And I got to the point where I would throw it in my plate stir, it'd be all over the counter the next morning.
Yeah.
It just got so, and I talked to someone who one of the head brewers for one of the breweries around here. He's like, no, you have better yeast than when you first opened the pack. The problem is it's no longer what you opened, and B, it's so vibrant. It's just wanting to just go berserk. So it was so healthy. Like I said, I was having it climbing up out of my airlock. It was turning into a nightmare to work with. And that was honestly the reason why I dumped it.
All right. Just again, a reminder, people out there, if you're listening on YouTube or Facebook, if you want to put a question about ingredients, we'll talk about it.
Yeah. And if we're ever talking about something that you want us to expand on, let us know too. Because like I said, I think reusing yeast is kind of a boring, or for probably many, is a boring topic, and a lot of people are shy to do away from it. I've done it, but that might be something people are very interested in hearing, because maybe it'll give them the push to do.
Back to this, and the reason we went on this topic is, and this is really the next place I was getting ready to go, because we do quickly kill some time talking about some of this. But my next thing was, writing down your recipe, and not just writing it down, the recipe, but writing down every step. Chris, are you good at that? Meaning, like, if you want to duplicate a beer, do you have something to go to?
I'm going to get in trouble.
Okay. I knew. That's why I'm asking Chris.
My notes are right here, buddy.
I knew your note. I knew before I asked the question who to ask about notes, because that's my point. If you finally now I'm one of those, once I make a beer, even if I make it perfected, my point was, okay, I made that one, I'll go to the next thing anyway. So I never cared. But so Chris, you do take notes. So when you do change the recipe a little bit or slightly, you could go back and duplicate it more.
Yeah, I write down as much information as possible, like even down to how much strike water I use, what my gravity readings are on my first runnings, everything, just so that if I do go back and I like I keep my spreadsheet, because that's how I send my recipes to Joey. I'll just like write down all my the amounts for all my fermentables, hops, yeast, and all that. So at least I know what I put into my beer, and then I write down all the steps that I use. Because if I wind up deviating, because I mean, y'all know me, I get distracted like so easily. I'll have a recipe that'll say like, I don't know, I'm supposed to do like a 45-minute hop addition. I'll be off screwing around doing something, and then I won't remember until like 30 minutes. And so like, okay, fine. So I was like, okay. And so instead of 45 minutes, I did 30. And instead of 15, I did 10, and it was 5, or, whatever the case may be. Or at the last minute, I decided, oh yeah, I want to try and boost it. So I dumped some priming sugar in at like 15 minutes left to go, or even just dumb stuff like that. Or I saw a bag of shit like lying around, and I wanted to dump it in there. So I added it in there too.
Now, how often do you go back to that folder?
Oh, all the time.
All the time.
See, that would be the best thing that I would say. It's kind of like, do what I say, not what I do. And I've said it openly on the podcast. My beers have gotten worse over the years because I'm always trying different things. I'm not in the zone of doing competition beers or perfecting recipes. I'm always trying new ingredients, new yeasts, new brewing systems. So, but even without that excuse, before I did that, I was the world's worst note taker. I've just never been. I do learn from my mistakes, but it's back to, I never like, hey, I mashed at 155 this time. The next time I do it, I might change it to 152. I never took those kind of notes. The bummer was when you brewed a really good beer, you're like, well, shit.
Yeah.
Well, that we'll get into, like I said, next week, we're going to get back into equipment and some of the temperatures and all that.
For me, it was more troubleshooting the really bad beers.
The next, the last ingredient, because last show, we talked about the wheats and all that. This show, kind of the yeast and the hops. My next thing is just what I'll call the unique ingredients. The pumpkin,
seeds of paradise,
the sugars. Let's go there first, because I know sugars are obviously important.
Yeah.
Chris, I'll ask you first. How often do you change the sugar that you might use in a recipe, or do you base it on the recipe alone, or when you get into your sugars, how much do you play around with that as far as different sugars than the recipe calls for?
Normally I try and stick to it, because you can go down a rabbit hole like
sugar.
With that.
I agree.
Like fairly similar.
Sugars, right? That's kind of what I'm bringing. The last 10 minutes, we're going to talk about sugar, and
that's it's almost like, I would say it's akin to water chemistry. Like you can go down just a whole rabbit hole, like with all that stuff. But like with sugar, obviously it would wind up affecting your beer much differently than water chemistry, or much more than water chemistry, because if you add too much, you can wind up like, over flavoring or over sweetening your beer. But I typically try and I do stick to the recipe, because once you do kind of deviate, because I don't have much of an understanding past just like the typical sugars that we have available to us, like whatever I might be able to get at Kroger or whatever, like your table sugar, even just like your like cane sugar and all that. But past that, like that's where my knowledge kind of drops off, because I've heard of folks using like, they've used actual like legit like syrup like in their beers and things of that nature in order to add
I put
both
maple
like
syrup
flavor.
in it one time.
Yeah, and like I've heard of folks doing that, but it's just like that's where my knowledge of when to add, how much to add, and what you're trying to do with it, that's where that drops off. So if it calls for it, I'll add it when it's supposed to. But in terms of experimenting, no, I haven't.
Okay, well then I'll ask Joey here in the store. What are the most popular sugars?
Well, I mean, obviously malt, but corn sugars by far. We sell a bunch of different like D180, D90. Those are like Belgian sugars. We've got candied sugars. We've got honey. Plenty of fermentable options.
Meaning if someone brings a recipe and has something, is that also something there's substitutions or is that more of is that harder to substitute because of the big differences in sugars and their flavors?
I would say most of the time it's less of a substitution and more of that's at your grocery store. Like maple syrup. I'll see recipes that'll call for maple syrup, and I'll go, we don't sell maple syrup. You can get that at your local grocery store, obviously. Right. I'm gonna whack it to pieces, so maybe you'll know what I'm saying, Chris. Turbinado sugar.
Yeah, turbinado.
Right?
Yeah,
I see that a lot in recipes.
Similar to a raw sugar.
I see that a lot of recipes. I'll see cane sugar, so forth and so on.
Turbinado sugar's got a lot bigger crystal too, so I don't know how that would even affect when it's in the beer. If it all dissolved, then it wouldn't matter. But...
And that would be the thing most people ask me, like, how big of a difference is it if I use turbinado sugar or your guys' invert sugar that you have here? And most of the time, like I said, I'll be honest and go, I don't 100% know, but odds are you're probably able to find that at your local grocery store.
Okay.
But very rarely is it something that we necessarily sub.
But it is something, that's what I'm saying. It's something that's more likely you're going to stay with the recipe calls for on the sugar than other things you might be able to sub and get the same.
Because you're not going to like sit there and say like, this recipe calls for raw sugar or whatever, but then like walk over and just grab like, I don't know, a pound of lactose or something like that.
Yeah, that's it's going to be wildly different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we lactose too, because lactose doesn't ferment. So
yeah, it's a non-fermentable. So it's so that's where understanding what each sugar does, how it's going to be used in your beer, that makes a whole lot of difference. And that's what I'm saying. You can go down a whole rabbit hole with that.
Well, we got lots of rabbit holes. We're going to do this every other week. We'll come up with a few rabbit holes.
Well, that's one of the things for me is like I actually find when you start talking sugars, I find it more interesting in the distilling process. And we joke, but we never really get too in depth with distilling. I think it would be a fantastic topic because when it comes to people who are distilling, check your state for whatever the legal things are, but it's one of those things where it becomes a very, very important part of them because most distillers aren't using traditional barley like beer brewers are.
Right.
So their sole fermenting is coming from that particular sugar. So their final product is greatly
affected by this.
Yeah, because I joke to people all the time, like their recipe will call for a pound of honey. And I'm like, just throw a pound of corn sugar in there. If you don't want to spend the money on honey. And they're like, oh my gosh, it's so much different. I'm like, yeah, but honey ferments so dry out. You're almost not going to know it was even there. That's the biggest problem I have with mead is for honey wine. Honey's the most expensive fermentable on the market. And unless you make a sweet one, you really don't even know it's there. So
dude, you remember that mead we
made? People did it back in the day because honey might have been the only sugar they had available.
Oh yeah, that's
so they had
it might have been readily available to them. That's why I don't like the term cheap beers, because back then, those adjuncts that Bud used was cheaper, was actually more expensive than barley. Okay. So, but I think distilling would be a great topic for sugars.
We don't have much more time, so the next thing is flavors, which I know Chris piddles around with flavors more than you or me.
A little bit.
Okay, but it is back to then the difference is, fresh versus dry versus just a flavoring. And I'll just throw it out there. I'm not even sure. Let's say strawberries, use fresh strawberry versus use a dry, some kind of a strawberry dry ingredient versus a strawberry flavor. Obviously to me, those three things should affect a flavor of a beer quite a bit.
So the difference would be like say if you're using fresh strawberries, it's going to be how you use it. Different flavor. We carry every flavoring out there, and people ask me like, what should I know? And I go, one, if you're using watermelon, think Jolly Rancher instead of fruit, instead of the actual watermelon.
Right.
And same thing with strawberry. Think more of a candied strawberry when you're talking our flavorings. And you're going to want to use those at bottling time, because if you use it during fermentation, you're never going to know it's there. Versus strawberry, the fruit, you just got to be careful to get all the wild yeast off of it, because once again, you could sour things up or turn things to vinegar because there's wild yeast on fruit. So just a matter of when and how you use them and what you're trying to look for out of it.
And I know I use the word strawberry because to me that was the quickest berry in my head I could think. But to me that would also go with pumpkin. Which
I'm thinking of a country music song.
But even pumpkin, there's fresh pumpkin. There's obviously canned pumpkin, and then obviously there's pumpkin flavoring.
Yeah.
Chris, have you used all three of those type pumpkins, or have you mainly just used canned or pureed?
No, I've done all three of those actually. So I've used whole pumpkin for the pumpkin beer that I typically make like every year. I've done canned pumpkin just as a quick substitute because I think it was like a year.
Did you notice a difference?
No, not really, because after you bake it out and then you add enough like brown sugar like to it, like it winds up just kind of evening out. Like, do I prefer doing like the whole 9 like with the actual like pumpkin? Yeah, that's just from a process standpoint.
You just said something though that I'm going to stop you, because that's the point. In your head, you prefer it, but if it doesn't make a difference, I make a pumpkin squash soup. I know we're talking beer instead of that, but I have roasted my own pumpkin and my own squash, and I've also just used canned pumpkin to make the same soup. And you're right. By the time you add all the other spices, I don't think it made a damn difference.
But that's
other than to tell somebody I used real pumpkin.
Well, that's the thing. It's like there are certain things. Back to everything else. There's certain things that you notice a dramatic difference with, and there's certain things you notice little to none. Me and my wife has in our house a thing that said, if I stirred it, it's homemade. And I've always argued, like, I don't make homemade spaghetti sauce because you open 3 cans and I open 1.
You have had this argument more than once.
Doesn't make your shit homemade.
Spaghetti.
No, but also like I know I don't want to use the word for a fact. We made homemade beef jerky. You'll never buy store-bought again. It tastes like dog food to me now. I cannot eat store-bought. Now there are other things like pumpkin, whether it's from a can, just note to self, the spices are not in the can, even though the can has
you can buy some.
I get that. But my point is, a big thing for me is sometimes like most canned foods have a ton of salt in them as a preservative and so forth and so on. Like there are some, like, it's back to personal preference, like green beans, I prefer canned over fresh green beans.
We're talking beer here.
I know,
but not your KFC meal.
No, my point is from that, it depends on what you're brewing up, and it depends on your taste buds, because there are certain things that you might like better that way. But I'll go back to
Chris and pumpkin. It seems like to me, fresh pumpkin and canned pumpkin is a better substitution. To me, when you get into the flavorings, to me, that's where the flavor seems to change to me, actually. Canned pumpkin, fresh pumpkin, then pumpkin flavor. Usually when I deal with
I see what you're saying.
When I usually deal with the word flavor, which means 2 drops of pumpkin flavor,
I'm following you now.
I don't think now the flavor's different.
For sure.
Yes, that
because
is different.
Like we have a pumpkin flavoring, but it's more on the spice side. I would say I get more nutmeg and cinnamon and clove than I do pumpkin, because it's meant to be like a pumpkin pie.
Right.
But I don't think my brain doesn't think pumpkin when I smell it.
Actually, because you even said Jolly Rancher. They're not using strawberry. They're using a strawberry flavor.
Using beaver.
Right.
Right. I mean, they didn't use anything at all that had real strawberry in it.
Yeah.
But so I do think that's where I might draw the line where I would substitute something.
But at the same point, that was what I was trying to use the analogy of. I don't do it yearly. I do it like once every other year. I do a watermelon wheat beer. And I very much like our watermelon flavoring in there, because it is a candied water. I just like that flavor in that particular beer. It's one of my simplest, quickest banged out beer that I can do. And every time I have people over, that keg disappears like that.
Right.
And it's the easiest, quickest beer I ever brewed.
Chris, you have a recipe that you like that you use a flavoring, not a ingredient, but a flavoring?
Yeah, it's the winter warmer recipe that I've got, where I actually use a graham cracker flavoring, along with a little bit like nutmeg and a few other spices. But yeah, graham cracker flavoring.
Did you ever use the peanut butter flavoring here, Chris?
Oh no, I haven't done anything with peanut butter since the
remember,
PB2 incident.
I tell everybody about that. Like, a lot of people, peanut butter beers are really popular.
Yeah, I've had a few. They're pretty good.
And a lot of people want to use all the recipes call for that powdered peanut butter protein mix.
That stuff sucks.
Yeah, it sucks. It's a pain to work with. You got like fudge at the bottom of your fermenter. Our peanut butter flavoring, in my opinion,
is a better option.
Tastes better. It's a better option. It tastes better because that powdered peanut butter, I don't like the flavor of it even when you use it. Right. But even that, but you don't want to use real peanut butter because you'd have no head retention or whatever because it's going to be full of oil. So it's like with brewing beer, but you see like a lot of pecan beers, and there are a lot of people who roast their own pecans and put it in there. I would say that probably, in my opinion, based on my taste buds, I prefer that.
I would assume that most peanut
pecan flavoring,
kind of our topic, which is a recipe and what you use in substitution. Do most peanut butter recipes call for peanut butter, or do they call for a flavoring?
They generally call for the PB2.
Okay, they actually
and that's what I'm saying. It's back to someone put a recipe online, it grabbed a hold, and that's just the way most people do it.
Okay.
In my experience, our peanut butter flavoring, I shouldn't say our peanut butter flavoring, it's available everywhere. Sure. Peanut butter flavoring is better because it tastes the way the beer reacts to it, and just ease of use and overall flavor. It just works fantastically.
All right.
I will never do that PB2 again.
We cannot do 30 minutes. I don't think the three of us will ever do a 30-minute
show.
But obviously, I think we did hit most of the ingredients the last two shows and how it affects your recipes.
So are we doing a part 3?
We're going to have to do part 3 because we want to do equipment and how equipment will affect recipe. That'll be our next show. We're going to deal with.
We'll do a recipe.
Then we'll do a recipe.
So that means in 2 weeks, don't tune in because that show's going to totally suck. Because name a part 3 movie that was ever good.
No, dude. To me, it's usually no. I'm going to argue
part
that
3 of anything that's ever been good.
It's usually the part 2 that's bad. It's part 3 where they come back.
Back to the Future 2 is better than part 1, in my opinion. But I'm just saying.
No, I think
Turtles 2 is better. Than
I
part
think 2 they throw together.
Terminator 2 is better than Terminator 1.
Yeah, that's facts right there.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
We're going to talk substitutions. All right, so we're going to go next show 2 weeks from now. We will get into equipment and how that would affect a duplicate, meaning the same recipe, multiple equipment options, how that'll affect. So, people have questions, email them ahead of time or do it on the show. We do watch the questions on Facebook if you're live.
Yep.
I know I don't like it, but I am going to say it. Click the subscribe button. Click the little bell. Smash that bell.
Smash the like.
Because we are live, we are getting better at doing the same time every other week.
Yeah.
And that way, if you're customers of HBYOB, we want you here. And obviously, you will get the reminder that we're going to be on. And because I've done retail a long time believe it or not, customers do know more than us sometimes, and some of the things they can come up with.
They definitely have nicer brewing equipment.
Well, sure. I mean, my point is, our customers can tell us things that we don't even know.
Yeah.
And we incorporate that into the show. So smash, like, subscribe. I hate it because everyone knows that, but people still have to say it. So I thought I'd say it at least one time. But
remind to get your dogs spayed and neutered.
Oh my God!
But we will have a part 3 and a part 4 now because we're gonna have to get into equipment.
There's not a single part 4 movie out there that's ever been any good.
Yeah,
you're saying we've reached the peak.
Yeah,
we're just gonna.
We are right.
It's gonna be like John Wick, like four John Wick movies.
There you go.
I didn't like the first.
Chris, if you want people to get a hold of you and or find you somewhere, give us some info.
Find me on Twitter at Chris Allen FFWX. Getting back into fantasy football content here within the next couple of weeks, but you can find me on there.
You got your show after this today?
No, not today.
Not today. Next time.
Should be next week. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't want anyone to get a hold of me, so I have nothing to say. Joey, give us a little bit of information about the store hours. Are you looking for employees? What's going on?
Still, if you would like to job here at HBYOB, please apply. Email me if you have any suggestions for the show. Please. Send me an email for that as well or text me. And other than that,
I said,
everyone have a great one.
See you in 2 weeks, right around 6:10, guys.
Same bet time, same bet
Say goodnight. Have a drink.
Cheers.